So I'm going to talk today about family and medical leave policies in the United States. This is a subject I've been working on for a long time, actually long before we had any real prospect of at least paid family leave policies. And so I want to talk a little bit about where we are, where we might go. If we have time, you will all get to help design a policy for the United States. We'll see if we get to that. But I do want to give you the opportunity at any point in this talk to ask any questions that you would like to. So let me start with a question for you. How many of you, when I talk about family and medical leave or parental family and medical leave, how many of you kind of think you know what I'm talking about versus don't have a clue? Oh, everybody. Okay, and maybe you all you knew. I know you also read a piece probably. Is that where you learned that, or did you know beforehand? Is that something? Okay, well, good. So that's great. So let me see. Is this the right one? I think it's this one. Okay, so let me just start with some terminology, just so we're on the same page. Can people? Yeah, you have a bigger screen here. So when I talk about parental leave, I'm talking about leave that occurs shortly after the birth or adoption of a child. And that's mostly what I'm going to actually be talking about today, although not exclusively. Now, parental leave can include maternity leave or paternity leave. So maternity leave is available only to mothers, paternity leave to fathers. Parental leave in principle might be in some combination for either mothers or fathers. And it depends on the country what the structure is. I'm going to, for the most part, lump those together. I will give it as a parenthetical note, though, in countries that have a fixed amount of parental leave, so 50 weeks of parental leave that's available to either the mothers or the fathers, and they can use that in any proportion. Guess who takes most of the leave? Mothers. In fact, and we might get into this more, a number of countries that have this structure have put what are sometimes referred to as daddy weeks or similar names, saying they're going to reserve a certain amount of leave that the fathers have to take, because if they don't do that, in many countries the fathers just don't take any. Well, we can talk about that more if we want. Family leave, that's leave to care for a sick family member. And we'll talk some more about that. And then medical leave is for your own illness. Now, I want to distinguish a little bit. You'll hear about medical leave and sick leave. Sick leave is typically a few days. You have a flu or you have a cold, and so you take some sick leave. That's actually a somewhat separate category in terms of the way the policies work. Medical leave tends to be for bigger medical problems. So you're getting treatment for cancer, or you have some kind of surgery. So it'll usually, medical leave will be weeks to months, although not always. And then finally, let me just mention here, job protection. This is saying after your leave, you have the right to return to your old job or an equivalent job. Okay, so those are some terms that we may be talking about. There are others, but we'll get to them. So this is showing you weeks of paid maternity leave. Actually, more precisely, what this is showing you is weeks of leave that are available to mothers after the birth or adoption of a child. And let's see, do I have a pointer? Yeah, so you can see in many countries we're talking about on the order of 30, 40, 50 weeks of leave. The OECD average here is, it looks like about 25 weeks, so roughly 6 months of leave. And then this here is showing you the wage replacement rates, which they vary, but typically in many countries they are 75, 80, 90, sometimes 100% of your previous pay, often up to a limit. Some countries are lower. And then we have the U.S., and many of you know about this. You notice here's the U.S. entry, which is 0 and 0. Okay? So we are definitely an outlier. In fact, my understanding is there's only something like 2 countries in the world that don't offer some kind of paid parental leave, rights to some kind of paid parental leave. Although we should be careful how we, when you hear that, because for example, in many developing countries, it's only going to be workers in the formal sector, and most workers are in the informal sector, or they have a right, but it's really not enforced. Yes. So I think, I can't remember. I think those are cases where it might be a wage replacement rate, but it's up to a fairly low limit, or it might have been a wage replacement rate, an initial wage replacement rate for, say, the first 20 weeks, and then it goes down. I can't remember, but I think it's one of those there. Okay, so with this introduction, let's take a vote. How many of you think that the U.S. should have some kind of paid parental leave policy? And what I mean by that is a policy that says if you're a worker and meets some qualifying conditions, you should have a right to take some period of time off, say when you're having or adopting a child. So how many of you are in favor? And you do not need to be shy if you disagree. We love disagreement here. Okay, how many of you are opposed, think we should not have that as a right? Wow, okay. All of you voted in favor, and even if there's some herd bias, some of you might have been afraid, it looks like it's pretty popular. That is what most people think as well. So the question is, why don't we? What would a policy look like? What are some of the considerations? And that's what I'm going to talk about for really the rest of the time, except that if we have time at the end, you'll get to design our policy. All right, so what do we have in the U.S.? We've had, since the 1990s, we have the Family and Medical Leave Act, the FMLA, which you may have heard of. And the FMLA offers 12 weeks of unpaid leave to qualifying workers. And it offers that not only for parental leave, but also family and medical leave. All right, so you can get 12 weeks of unpaid leave, and you have job protection, which means you have a right to return to your old job. So you don't get paid, but you at least are allowed to take time off. With a but. The but is you have to qualify. And what does it take to qualify? There's a few conditions, but there's two main things. The first is you have to meet a work history requirement, that is, you worked for at least 12 months for the firm you're with, for the employer you're with, and at least 1,250 hours in the past year. So that means if you're a part-time worker who's working half-time, you won't qualify. Okay, so you've got to be, you don't have to be full-time, but you have to have worked a considerable number of hours. And then the second thing is you have to work for an employer that's not a small employer. And what a small employer here means is the employer has less than 50 employees it's actually in a 75-mile radius. It turns out those conditions mean only about 60% of workers even qualify for this unpaid leave. Okay? So, and another thing I'll point out, it's gender neutral, and we'll talk about that, but what I mean by that is both men and women have exactly the same rights. Limited as they are, they're exactly the same for men and women. This is in contrast to many European countries where particularly the parental leave piece often, as I mentioned, has a chunk that is dedicated towards mothers and then sometimes a piece that's dedicated towards fathers. And another kind of fact, because when I got into this, and this was a long time ago, I thought about sort of enlightened European countries and the backward US, but it is worth pointing out that many of these policies originated out of protective legislation. And what that meant was women were viewed as too frail to work immediately after having kids. And so they were actually required, and in some countries still are required, to take some number of weeks of leave either just before and or just after the pregnancy. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, so what do we have in the US? It turns out there's actually, although we do not have any kind of federal paid leave, there is a lot of activity at the state level. So currently there are 11 states plus the District of Columbia that have some kind of paid family leave program in place. And if you look, so I'll show you here the timing. The first state to put this in place was California in 2004. We went 5 years till the next state, New Jersey. That was in 2009. And then Rhode Island 2014 and New York 2018. So over a 14-year period, we had 4 states gradually put policies in place. Since 2018, we have 7 states plus the District of Columbia. So just in the last few years that have put these policies either in place or they're on the books and about to be implemented. So this map gives you a sense of what they look like. The states in pink are the ones that have active, currently operating paid family leave programs. The ones that are in blue have programs that are in place but not yet active, and maybe DC is active now. I didn't think DC was quite in place yet. And then the ones in red or orange or whatever that is have nothing, although some of them have efforts going on. Actually, the yellow ones have paid family leave legislation introduced but not enacted. Now, I mean, you'll see that certainly if you look at this, particularly if you look at the ones in pink, this is not a random distribution of states, right, by any means. I mean, you're basically talking about the Northeast and the West Coast, and then Colorado, pretty much. But you know, if we broaden it to the ones that are at least looking at paid leave, the yellow states, you know, that's a much wider grouping. Not there's some states we're missing here, though, I will note. Okay, so what do these policies look like? The early policies typically guaranteed somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks, and I'm talking here about the after a birth or adoption. Typically guaranteed 4 to 6 weeks of leave at a wage replacement rate of 55 to 66%. So the wage replacement rate is if you earn $10 an hour, if it's a 55% wage replacement rate, you're essentially getting $5.50 an hour while you're on leave. So it's the percentage of your wage that's replaced. The other thing, though, to point out, in addition to the wage replacement rate, what matters a lot is the maximum amount that you can get. So for example, at least when it was originally passed, California had a wage replacement rate of 55%. New Jersey had a wage replacement rate of 66%, but the maximum you could get in California was much higher. It was something, I think, about $1,100 a week, up to $1,100 a week of benefits versus $600 and something. And so it's how much of your wages are replaced, but then when does it stop that matters. If you have a high wage replacement rate, but a low maximum, that's going to tend to help people who are lower earners more. If it's a lower replacement rate and a higher maximum, it's going to go up more into the middle class. Yes? You say like if they replace like their hourly wages, but how do you know how many hours? Yeah, you know, it's actually, I mean, I was using that as an example. What they actually do is they'll compute your earnings over a period of time and then take the average total earnings you get and replace that. So yeah, I was saying if you worked 40 hours a week at $10 an hour, well then it's going to be, your base is going to be $400 a week. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's actually how they do it. Yeah. Was there another question? No. Okay. The other thing is that states that have more recently put these policies in place typically have more generous policies, often 75, 80, sometimes even close to 100% wage replacement rate. And the early states, most or all of the early states have actually made their programs more generous over time. Then the other key factor is in most cases, the eligibility requirements are looser than those in the FMLA. So I said for the FMLA, you had to have 1,250 hours with the same employer over the last 12 months. In many of the other states, it's looser, sometimes much looser. For example, California, it's basically a $300 total earnings requirement, which is really, quite low. And then financing is almost all, well, it's always by payroll taxes. Who can tell me what payroll taxes are? Yeah.
So when like the owner of like a small business, like how much earnings their workers make, they have to pay a certain amount.
They do, but also what about the employee? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how many of you have you looked at your paycheck and It used to say FICA. What does it now say? Social Security and Medicare, I think is what it usually says. Those are payroll taxes. So the financing in the U.S. in these state programs is always through payroll taxes, typically just on the employees. So actually the employer in most states actually doesn't have to contribute, only the employee does. And job protection is provided sometimes, but not in some states, but not others. So in many states, you can take leave, you don't have a job guaranteed when you return. Beyond what's in the FMLA. If you qualify for the FMLA, you'll get job protection there, but if not, you won't. Okay, so what are some of the arguments in favor of paid family leave? There's two principal arguments that people make. The first is there's kind of what we can broadly think of as labor market benefits. So one is it just sort of improves work-life balance. It's just really hard. I mean, in the world we live in today, in most cases, kids are born into families that are either single-head of household families or both parents are working. Obviously, that's not always the case, but that's very frequently the case. It's very hard to deal with this juggling act, and this is a way to help. And this is also true, by the way, for family and medical leave as well. So the hope is it'll just make life a little bit easier for people, and then also that it will have other direct benefits. One of the big ones would be some people, when they have a kid and they don't have the ability to take leave, they just quit their jobs. And that can be bad for them individually. It can be bad for the country because you're losing human capital. They've gained skills on these jobs. If they can't come back to those jobs, they lose them. So that's an important issue. We have lots of evidence that there's what's often referred to as a motherhood penalty. So if you look at earnings of men and women, they track pretty well. I mean, women tend to earn, when you adjust for various characteristics, tend to earn a little bit less than men. But up until the point they have kids, they track pretty well. And then we see in many cases women's earnings sort of fall off a cliff when they have kids. And so that creates this big, what's referred to as a motherhood penalty, a loss to mothers in terms of earnings and other job attributes. And so it's hopefully going to, and the empirical evidence suggests that it is helpful with this. Another point, and this can get kind of technical, but I'll just mention it because people don't often think of this, is in economic terms, it can reduce an adverse selection problem. What I mean by this is if I'm an employer that wants to offer leave, that believes it's a good thing to do, but other employers that I'm competing with are not offering leave, I could be placed at a disadvantage. And so this might sort of even the playing field a bit. Okay. Any questions before I move on? Yes?
Why is that a good thing? Because wouldn't employers have to compete to appeal to more employees? Why wouldn't that be better?
Well, so yes, I mean, in some cases you see that it working out that way. So a lot of Silicon Valley jobs, that you've got very highly educated workers. They're competing very hard. It may be a benefit that actually makes them more attractive to the employees they want to get. And actually, you'll see in those places, by the way, in some sense, all of this stuff we're talking about is irrelevant because they're offering far more generous benefits than the things we're talking about here. But in many cases, when you're dealing with, say, less skilled workers who are in less high demand, who are more substitutable, if I'm offering a generous leave policy and you're not, I might be disadvantaging myself because I get a lot of the employees who want to take leave. I mean, that's why I'm attractive to them. And so it raises my costs relative to somebody else's. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So the other thing is health and developmental benefits. And so these are a variety. There's a good reason to believe, childbirth is actually, it's difficult. It's physically, mentally difficult. So having some time may be helpful. There's also evidence that it can be helpful for the health of children. For example, infant mortality rates are actually a bit lower if you have more generous leave. There may be other developmental advantages to children of having leave. And then similarly, if we're talking about leaves where, say, you're you're taking care of a sick parent, having the ability to do that can both have financial benefits, but also might have some other kind of actual health benefits as well, mental health and so forth. What are some of the concerns? Well, one concern that I actually have not put on this slide is that some people just don't like the idea of interfering with markets. Why should we get the government involved in private markets? Employers and I'm just saying that, I'm not saying you agree, I'm saying that is an argument you will hear frequently. Why, we're America, we don't do those kinds of things. It also, there's a concern it could be costly for employers. Now, employers do not directly pay for these leaves, at least not the portion that's guaranteed by the government, right? That they may pay into a fund that helps for that, but the check is not coming from the employer, it's coming from the government in some form. But still, there could be other costs to employers. For example, you may have more difficulty in coordinating the operations of your business. So there could be a variety of costs. There's also a concern that potentially this could lead to various forms of discrimination. Just one second. And in particular, if you have really long leaves and you have a group that is more likely to take those leaves than others, you may be hesitant about hiring them, or you may be hesitant about, say, promoting them into positions where time off work is costly. Guess which groups might be most affected by that? It often might be employees that the employers view as likely to become mothers or likely to become caretakers, right? So it could lead to gender discrimination. Yes?
So you said that other countries have like certain, like the mothers are promised more time than the fathers in other countries.
Yes, but in most countries, they are, yes, but that difference is actually quite small. In most countries, there might be 6 weeks or maybe 12 weeks reserved for the mother, but most of it could, in principle, be split either way. What I was saying, though, empirically, what we see is that mothers tend to be the ones that take most of the leave, even when fathers have a right to. Yes?
Are there actually mothers who are like having babies and coming back to work the next day? Like, aren't most
In the U.S., there are.
forced to take some kind of leave?
Yes, I mean, if you look at the data, there are some mothers in the U.S. who come to work, I don't know if it's the next day, but very soon thereafter. I don't know how they do it, and I mean, right, physically in most cases, you cannot come back to work the next day. Now, how quickly can you come back to work? I mean, I don't know. It probably depends on your, how your pregnancy and your childbirth go. But yeah, we do, if you look at least at survey data, a surprising number of cases you have mothers apparently coming back to work extremely quickly. Yes?
Do most of these holidays count like for like weeks before the child is born, and like does it start like as soon as the child is born and then like it goes on?
So in the U.S., it's usually when the child is born. In some European countries or some other countries, they'll actually start before the due date. And I should say, in answer to the question about how do people come back so quickly, most people have access to some time off. I mean, okay, I know I'm about to give birth. If I save vacation days. If I have any sick leave, I can take that. So in many cases, even without an explicit policy, people can, get a week or two, or some cases more, depending on the employer. So most people can take some period of time off work, but in many cases that could be quite limited. I mean, if you're a cashier for some, in some service job, I mean, often the leave you'll have available may be quite limited. It's also true that many employers will kind of give you a break. They might say, okay, we understand you can't come, you gave birth on Friday, you can't be at work on Sunday, right? But, but that could be pretty limited. Yes? No, well, usually not. I mean, typically not if you're sort of a low-wage employee. If you're working in Silicon Valley, you are paid for it. Usually you're not. Sometimes with small employers, they'll cut you a break, and but okay. Well, sorry.
The question is, have there
Early parenthood, you're saying, or?
Early parenthood. I don't mean early in one's life. I mean the first couple months.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yes, there have been studies, and yes, it's very stressful, and there is evidence that having some leave available is helpful for that. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So when I was mentioning kind of benefits to mothers, actually many, and fathers too, I should say, fathers benefit too. Those, if you have healthier parents by, mental health, physical health, that's good for kids too. So yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, from a cost perspective,
Yes.
talk about here in the U.S., like a lot of times it comes out of the employee's payroll taxes.
Yes.
Sometimes employers just pay, depends on the corporation. But in European countries and other countries where they have these very long standing policies where they can take up to like some of them are crazy long, like you're talking 16 weeks of leave,
Oh, more.
And so
Some of them are a year.
how do they fund that?
So if you look at many European countries, they have very extensive social welfare programs. Those are usually going to be funded in some way by payroll taxes. The payroll tax rate will be quite high. So, one thing when you hear about, it is true that when people talk about countries with strong social welfare systems, and here we're talking about, Scandinavia, Germany, places like that, taxes tend to be higher. So you pay more. Now, you also get a lot of things. I mean, for example, health, nobody goes bankrupt because of a healthcare expense in these countries. Many of these other things, that's what you're paying for. But yeah, they are paying for it. There's not a free lunch. Okay, I got lots of questions. Yes.
To add on to that, if we have, a large population of workers who, if you're taking, say, 30 weeks off, that's going to be a lot of money. A lot of workers who don't ever take that work off are going to be paying for other people's paid leave. How can we kind of balance the fairness of, like, say, I make a personal choice not to have children.
Yeah.
But I'm still paying
Yeah.
for others who take a
Yeah.
constant-
So, that's a really good point, and I think it is one reason why, whether this is good or bad, that's for you to decide, but that is one reason why the social welfare system in the U.S. is much weaker than in many other countries. Many people feel like, okay, I'm not going to have kids, and so it's unfair to me, and so I don't want to be, I don't want to pay more than my fair share. The notion of a social welfare system is you don't always know what's going to come up, and you're buying insurance in a sense. The other thing I will point out for some of these, and less true for parental leave, but when we're talking about family and medical leave, many of those, if you want to call them risks of your taking leave, you're not necessarily going to know about them ahead of time. You're not going to know if you're going to have a parent or yourself who gets some illness where you want some leave. Now, you could argue, well, I know that if that happens, I'm not going to do it, my spouse is going to do it, but that doesn't really, I think, that gets, I would not want to make that argument. Let me put it that way. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I think two things. One, I'm Canadian, born and raised.
Okay.
I've been paying into payroll taxes
Yeah.
for years. I
Yeah.
don't have any children.
Right.
But I think part of it is the culture. Like Canada's a
Yeah.
collectivist culture. The U.S.
Yeah.
is individualist. I'm happy to
Yeah.
pay
Yeah.
for parents to take parental leave, even if I never have children, because that's our culture, right? Like we're happy to contribute to the social welfare of others, not just ourselves.
I think that's exactly right. That you'll find in countries with strong social welfare systems, that is the view. That view is less strongly held in the U.S., although I want to point out that many people, probably a majority is my guess, recognize that kind of these collective goods that are things that we might be willing to pay for even if we don't all benefit. So I don't want to exaggerate that argument.
I was going to say, though, I don't really think in Canada we would pay more taxes. Like, I'm looking at the tax brackets, and, if I make $45,000, I pay 22% in the
Yeah.
U.S. and only 15% in Canada. So isn't it more like that
Well-
the U.S. is spending tax money on things like military?
So there's lots of ways we spend money, and we could, yes, and I'm not going to go there today just because, we only have like 16 more minutes, and we could spend the next 16 hours on that. Certainly, there are broader sets of choices that, for whatever reason, are made differently. Yes? Yeah, that is a frequently made argument, and I think there is merit to it. I will say, I think my view, having looked at this for a long time, is on balance, the argument is correct that there are going to be some economic gains. I suspect they are relatively small, and I actually frame this differently. My view is if you can have something that people want, that gives people more flexibility, that reduces stress, that feels right, that feels more just, and you didn't have to pay a lot for it, it wasn't very costly, then I would think it's a good deal. If you get a gain on top of that, that's so much the better. It's a funny thing, I'm an economist and people always want me to make these arguments that it's going to raise GDP, and I'm like, yeah, maybe. I don't believe it's 12%, honestly, even though I think I was one of the authors on that article. You have compromises, but no, it's probably reporting a study that indicated that. But, I think probably on net it is positive in terms of the economic benefits, and there's lots of other things. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit just because I don't think we're going to get to design a policy, but I do want to talk about some of the issues around designing a policy. So let's see. Okay, I think I mentioned some of these. What are some of the concerns? I want to also point out the issue of potentially leading to discrimination. This is not a trivial one. So one of the things, if you look at some of the European countries with very long leave periods, and here in many cases, I could be talking about, a Sweden where you might be talking about close to a year, sometimes maybe even a little more than a year. If you have a couple of kids, you might have a couple of years. We do see evidence of some kind of gender segmentation. So for example, women are less likely to get into managerial jobs. They're less likely to get into jobs that are at the highest level. That's something we should be aware of. Now, what is the length of time where that happens? Well, in the European context, we're probably talking about leaves of 6 to 12 months or more, far longer than anything we're talking about in the US. But I do want to point out, we actually don't know how the European experience translates into the US. So whether it would be 6 months in the US or it'd be some shorter period, I just don't think we know. Yeah?
Do we not see that discrimination in the American context?
No, not in the same degree, no. I'm not saying there's not discrimination. I'm just saying you don't see it to the same degree. And people who've studied this think this is part of the reason. But yeah, obviously there's gender discrimination everywhere. I'm absolutely not saying that that's not the case. All right, so what are some of the design issues we need to think about if we're coming up with a policy? Well, the first is, how long is your leave right? It's a right to leave, right? It says you have a kid. How long are you allowed to take off work? Is the employer required to let you take off work? So in the US, we're typically talking in the States 6 to 12 weeks. The unpaid FMLA is 12 weeks. In many other industrialized countries, it's much, much longer than that. And we've already talked about this a little bit, what's the wage replacement rate? So what's the percentage of your wages that you're going to get? And up to what maximum level? Who's eligible? How much? You need some employment history. How long do you have to have worked? How do we treat it if does it need to be a single employer, or can it be across multiple employers? Should your policy be gender neutral or not? Now this one actually initially seems obvious. In fact, I think most of us in the US have come to the view it should be a gender neutral policy. And what I mean by that is that, let's just say there's a right to 12 weeks of leave. And we're talking about parental leave. There's a right to 12 weeks for each parent, right? There's no distinction between mothers and fathers. In most European countries, that is not the tradition. It's been more of a family right. And as we've talked about, when it's a family right, mothers tend to be the ones taking most of the leave. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Think about this. If we had a 24-week leave in the US, so 12 times 2, and we said, well, either parent could in principle take it, what we're going to find almost certainly in practice is that mothers take more of it, but that would mean there could be in principle up to 24 weeks available to the mother, right? Versus in a gender-neutral system, there's only 12 weeks available to the mother and 12 weeks available to the father. I'll tell you from my own view, the reason I favor a gender-neutral policy is we have these norms that women are the ones who end up doing most of the child care, most of the elder care, and so forth. I think we want to try to shift those norms, difficult though that may be. And so I think the notion of gender neutrality is the way to go. But I recognize there's potential cost to that. None of this stuff, there's always a cost to whatever you decide to do. Job protection, should you have job protection during the leave period? My own personal view is yes. That's pretty unambiguous, that if you don't have job protection, I don't really think it's leave. But as I mentioned, many state policies currently do not give you job protection beyond what is in the FMLA. Should small employers be exempt? And if I have time, I'll talk about a little research we've done on this. My answer is no. They should not be exempt. What is the argument for why small employers are exempt? The notion that's out there is that small employers have more difficulty. They have more difficulty handling an absence by their employees than large employers. I don't think there's really any very good empirical evidence for that. And actually work that we've done that maybe I'll have a chance to talk about later, we've surveyed small employers. Well, I'll tell you now since I don't know how much time I have. We've surveyed small employers. What we did is we looked at New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And we actually surveyed them before New York's policy went into place and surveyed them after. And so the comparison we ended up making, New Jersey turned out to be complicated. So we compared Pennsylvania, which did not put a policy in place, to New York, which did, and looked at how employers view these programs, small employers. These are less than 100 employees. And what we found was these programs were very popular both before and after they were put in place. And that was true actually everywhere, but it was true in the states, and like in this case in New York, that was putting these policies in place. So there's no evidence actually that this is a tougher nut to crack for small employers, despite what a lot of the trade groups will claim. And then finally financing. There's various ways we could finance these. Empirically, it seems to be payroll taxes are the way we have been doing it. You could, in principle, my own personal preference would be to finance this out of general revenues rather than payroll taxes. But the issue with that is general revenues aren't necessarily guaranteed. And so you could get a new state legislature or a new Congress who just says, we're not going to fund this. That's much harder to do with payroll taxes because you're paying into like a reserve fund. And so there could be political arguments. Okay, there's more. So the devil is in the details. Everybody in the class wants a paid family leave policy. But how do you structure it is going to determine whether it's successful or not. What events qualify for your leave? Well, in the case of parental leave, it's pretty clear. It's birth or adoption of a child. That's a very clear, verifiable event. It's, yes. Yes, you could do foster care too. Yeah, and I actually am not sure but sure, that's another easily verifiable event. But I need to care for my sick parent. That's going to be much squishier to verify, right? Presumably you'll get some kind of doctor certification, but is it, do you really need, do you need to be off work full time, or do you just need a couple hours a day, or what is it? It just gets much harder, right? Similarly, for your own medical condition, those things get harder. I'm not saying they're insurmountable, but their employers are going to get more concerned, right? That, employers tend to be concerned, is the system going to be abused? And so those are concerns. Which family members are you going to be able to take leave to deal with a health problem? Well, some of these are pretty obvious. If it's your own kids, that's pretty straightforward. I think if it's your grandparents or a spouse, those seem pretty straightforward. What about a sibling? Should you be able to take time off work to care for a sibling? What about, should you be able to designate a significant other or some number of significant others that you could take time off for? These are hard questions, right? And these are ones that actually have stymied efforts, I think, to come up with policies. States have come up with different solutions, but none of them are perfect. And again, you do want to be worried about, this could get very expensive. If your rights to take leave get expansive, the program could get very expensive and it could just crash and burn, right? And so that could be an issue. A number of others. Maybe I won't spend time on those. Okay, what does the literature tell us? Well, just as you voted 100% in favor of at least parental leave. Oh, actually, you voted more generally, I think, in favor. These are popular, and it turns out across the political spectrum. If you take surveys of Republicans, you will find a substantial majority of Republicans are in favor of paid family leave policies. Obviously, larger majorities of Democrats, but these are popular. What do these programs do? They increase leave taking. That's not a surprise. I mean, these programs are designed to provide leave, and they do. They also, I talked about some of the potential benefits where they increase wages and job continuity and labor market conditions. Most of the evidence suggests that's the case as long as the leaves aren't too long. So in the European context, as long as you're talking about 3, 4, 5 months, gets less clear when you go, beyond 6 months. It gets harder to tell. We don't really know in the U.S. We don't have any experience that's longer than 12 weeks. But most of the evidence suggests these labor market benefits. There are a couple of studies that raise questions about that. And then there are probably fairly modest, but some health benefits. And by health, I mean broadly defined. So these are health benefits for parents, developmental benefits, and health benefits for children. Probably not huge, but there's some. So I think for the most part, the literature does suggest that we are seeing these kinds of benefits. There's lots, whenever one of these policies is proposed, employer groups oppose it adamantly. And these are particularly, like the American Chamber of Commerce, some of the small business groups. They're going to talk about how it's going to be the end of the world, competitiveness will decline and so forth. And at least at the state level, what we have found pretty consistently is once these policies are put in place, it's sort of a non-event for employers. They adjust. It's not, I'm not saying all employers are in favor, but it just kind of isn't a big deal. And so a lot of that opposition seems to be, lobbying at the time these policies are being proposed or being fought over. Once they're in place, not that big a deal. Yes?
Have there been studies done for the small businesses who, when someone goes on leave, they have to obviously replace the labor? What happens to those replacement workers?
Yeah. In small businesses, most of the time what's going to happen is some combination of other workers pick up the slack. Sometimes in larger businesses, more commonly might hire temporary workers, so there's some of that. That seems pretty limited. Certain things, a lot of activities that go on in a firm you actually can delay, and so you'll take, the urgent things you'll get done probably with other workers doing that, and then some of the other stuff just gets delayed till the person comes back. I don't want to say that these are non-issues. They are issues. They don't seem in most cases to be that big a deal. Yes?
So usually for welfare programs, there's a big critique that people just abuse and take advantage of the system. I was just wondering how salient that argument would be in this context, if there was any empirics with the state more expensive.
So I think there is little indication that you have an issue with parental leave. That because again, it's just a very definable event. Now, there are some people who potentially might actually start working early so they qualify. That's not necessarily a bad thing. And the answer is I don't think we have a lot of good evidence because a lot of these policies are new. I am concerned if you put very expansive policies in place for kind of harder to verify needs of leave that you may have bigger issues. You will hear employers complaining about things like that their employees happen to need medical leave or family leave disproportionately on Mondays and Fridays, that sort of thing. So there certainly is going to be some potential for abuse in the system. And I think that's why when you're designing it, you actually need, so when I was with this bipartisan working group, I was one of the kind of the economists, but I'm sort of on the left, but I'd constantly be saying, well, for some of these things, you do need to worry about this stuff. And some people, I think, maybe don't worry enough. So yeah, the answer is a lot depends on good policy design. Yes? Yeah.
I was going to say, like, when we look at, like, the United States that have specific laws, it's only a handful, most of them are blue states that have
Right.
state level
Right.
laws. How can we, how are you, I guess, in working to agenda set for the specific bipartisan policies you are laying out, one that people have already agreed on both sides?
Well, so I should say that project is done. And obviously we were not completely successful, although, I think a process like that, the use of it is getting people sort of on the left and the right together and saying, what can we agree on? Now, I should be clear, the people who are on the right, they were not on the extreme right. These are kind of, I think, people, they're Republicans, in many cases working with Republican politicians, but who had a basic belief that, some kind of leave was at least worth considering. I think, what you can do, hopefully, is to say, what are the compromises where maybe we can come to some agreement? Obviously, we haven't gotten there yet, but I will tell you, I am much more optimistic than I was when we started that process. I think we will have some kind of national leave policy in place in the next, 5 or 10 years. That seems like a long time, but in some sense, I wasn't sure we'd ever get there. I'm still not. So I think we're making progress. Okay, I think we're just about out of time. Is there one last question? I know we get kicked out of the room soon. So yes.
Is the resistance towards implementing a policy like this, is it tied to workplace culture? Because I know Japan, they're kind of notorious for having a very overworked population, yet they still had like sizable parental leave in place.
So I think, the answer is I don't know, but what I would say is it probably is related to the notion of kind of a more individualistic culture in the U.S. and the idea of, for many people, we want to keep the government out of things more generally, which I think is less true in Japan. Oh, well, thank you very much. I think we're out of time, so let's stop.